this lesson is to learn about CSS3 and some of the new features that were introduced with it, how to use text effects, transforms, transitions, and how to use web fonts. The purpose of this is to show you how CSS has evolved and what features of CSS3 are actually going to allow us to use HTML5 to replace Flash for animations. CSS3 is the current version of CSS. It has been a standard that was introduced in 2014. It was in draft status since 2007. One of the requirements was that it had to be fully backwards compliant. So everything that came out before it, all the CSS elements that have been used, are involved in CSS3. One of the things they made a change to is if you ever wanted to look at the CSS standards, they were one great big document with a large amount of requirements and all sorts of information. And what they have done is they've broken those down into what are called working modules. Currently, there are over 50 different modules. The CSS working group is the publishing author. Some of the new features that were introduced in CSS3 are going to be things like the rounded corners, the border radius that we played with before. We have things like our backgrounds. We can now control the size of a background. We can do origin and clip, which controls what happens when a background goes outside of a div. We can also set our gradients, which we've played with already. We have shadow effects, which we've played with already. And then we have some other effects that we have not played with yet. These are the text effects. So we're going to play with some effects such as overflow, wrap, and break, and then we'll also do things like web fonts, which allows us to actually use a font on our web page that may or may not actually be installed on the end user's computer. After that, we're going to play with some things like transforms, where we can do things like 2D and 3-dimensional rotation of objects. We can translate things, which means to slide them around on the page. We can rotate them, we can scale them to make them larger, we can skew them so that way we can actually take them out of proportion if we want. And then we have transitions. So this is a basic introduction to some minor animation features, but I am going to be able to take my text box or a division or whatever and make it larger or smaller, and the user can actually watch it grow and shrink and spin, and it can get skewed and so forth. So we can specify the distance that it moves, we can specify its direction, and also the speed. For this lesson, I created a new document called fonts and effects.html. Once again, it is just strictly a copy of template.html. I added a link to it to my index.html file, and I changed my header to fonts and effects, and also my title to fonts and effects. And I also added my body style so that the font family is Arial. That is all that I've done to this document so far. What I want to do is I want to play with some text effects and show you what the different effects do. I'm going to create a div inside of my content div. I'm going to call it small box because it's going to be a small box when we're done. And I am going to put some text here that says this is the text in the small box. Okay, so if I just have this and I refresh, I get some text that says this is the text in the small box. I want to start styling that a little bit, so it is an ID, so it's # small dash box. And then how do I want to style it? It goes in here. So the first thing I am going to do is set the border to 1 pixel solid black. And I want to, actually before we do that, I'm going to show you, here's my box, but I want to set its width to 100 pixels. Okay, now when I set the width of this div, what we have seen in the prior lessons is that we end up getting what looks more like a column because all of our text in here is going to start wrapping. All right, so I'm going to save this and refresh, and now I get a box where the text wraps. Now, if the idea was not to have this text wrap, instead I want it to just continue, then what I can do is I can turn that off, and it is the white space, and I'm going to set that to no wrap. Now, when I do this, what will happen is the box remains 100 pixels wide, but the text now goes outside of the box. I don't necessarily want it to do that. So what I would like to do is hide the text that goes outside of the box here. To do this, I'm going to play with what's called an overflow, and I'm going to set it to hidden. Now what will happen is when this thing overflows, the data that goes outside of the box actually will not appear. So it's gone. And I cannot highlight outside of the box, so I cannot get to that text to see what is in there. This is not necessarily ideal because to the end user it just looks like stuff is missing. So I want to play with a means to tell the user that there's something there. And to do that, I'm going to play with what's called the text overflow. Now by default, text overflow is set to clip, which is exactly what it did here. When I refresh, I get the same thing. And it clips off. But instead of clipping, what I can do is I could tell it to put an ellipsis in here. And then when I put the ellipsis and refresh, you'll see that I now get 3 dots to show to the user, hey, there's more stuff in this box. Clip is the default. Ellipsis shows me the 3 little dots. I could set this equal to a string, so that way it would show a string to me, something like in Excel, where it just simply says value with some pound signs around it to show you that it's too big of a value. I could set it to initial, so whatever the initial value was, or I could also set it to inherit, which would actually allow it to inherit the property from its parent container object. All right, so my overflow is what states that this stuff is supposed to be hidden, the thing that goes outside. And what I want to do is I want to make it when I hover my mouse over this that it will show the rest of the text to me. The ellipsis is there as a visual cue to state, hey, there's more stuff here, but I want it that if I hold the mouse over it, the rest shows up. The way that I'm going to do that is to play with my pseudo classes. So I'm going to say small box, and when I hover over it, what do I want it to do? So when I hover over it, I want to change the overflow to inherit. And now what that will do is it will take and get its overflow from the parent container div, which in this case is the content div. And the content div doesn't have anything set, so what it's going to do is actually show it to me. So when I bring my mouse up here, I can see this is it's ellipsis, so I know there's more stuff. If I hover, now I get the remainder of that text. When I come off of it, then it goes back to just the ellipsis. So now it's a means for me to show the user that, hey, there's too much stuff to fit in this box, but if you hover over it, you get the rest of it. Sometimes we don't want our text to necessarily do this. Sometimes we do actually want to have a box with the text wrapping. So I'm going to make another div in here, and I'm going to call it smallbox2. And my smallbox2 has a really long word. So this is a really okay, so I'm just trying to make a really long word, and what I want to do is smallbox2 is I want to set its width also equal to, let's say, 120 pixels. And we'll set its border color to 1 pixel solid black. And so now when I refresh, this is what I get. And this is a really long word. Doesn't wrap and it goes outside. So I have options. I can set this so that it gets cut off and you wouldn't actually see it. Or sometimes I really do want this to show up. What I can do is I can play with the option to word wrap it. To word wrap, I'm going to add word wrap and break word. Okay, so now what will happen when I refresh my page over here is that that really long word will get wrapped depending on where it ends up. So if I make this 100 pixels, you will notice it does not necessarily wrap based on words. It wraps at that location. So in this case, really does get cut in half. And it may or may not look right, but if I want it to word wrap, this is how I'm going to wrap it. Sometimes I really want for this to actually display the text, and I don't want it to break words. So we can use hyphenated words. I'm going to make this really, with hyphens in between each of these. Okay, save this and refresh over here. All right, now it actually does word wrap correctly here, so I don't want to do that. Let's see if we can break it. All right, so what's happening is by doing word wrap, I am telling it to actually break these apart as words, and it unfortunately recognizes that these are hyphens. What I can do, though, is instead of a word wrap, I can do a word break. And what this will do is it will ensure that all of the browsers really do break at the hyphens. And I can do a keep all, which will tell it, don't let it break individual words in half. But if I do something like break all, then I will end up with some browsers that will render it like this, where it actually does not break the words. It allows it to wrap wherever it wants it to. So if I want to break all, then it can break wherever it wants. But if I want to keep all, then I make sure that it only breaks if there's a hyphen or some other form of punctuation first. The next thing that I want to play with is embedding fonts in my website. Sometimes I will include a font when we play with the font family, and instead of including a font that I know for a fact that everybody has because we get bored of Arial, I can include my own fonts. Now I want to do this sparingly because if I include a font, then whoever is looking at my website has to download that font first, and some browsers will actually force the operating system to install the font. So I only want to use this for emphasis and use it sparingly. But what I have done is I created a folder called Fonts, and in Fonts I have included 2 Truetype fonts. There is a catch to this. Only some of the browsers understand Truetype fonts. There are other formats out there. There are what are called WOFF files, which are the Web Open Font families. And you can go online, you can do a search for different fonts, but you will be able to find some online. Make sure that you check the license to make sure you're allowed to use it on a website for use for everybody to look at. But once you have a font, then we can actually include that in our document. So back in my document, what I want to do is I'm going to make a section, and this is a div, and I will call it, actually let's not do an ID, let's do a class, because I want to apply this to multiple paragraphs. So I'm going to say that the class is Aftershock, and that's the actual name of the font. So I'm going to include text in here that is going to be that style. So what I want to do is I'm going to include a paragraph that says, this is my Aftershock font. Okay, so if I come over here, right now it's formatted as Arial, but I want to format it using that Aftershock font. This is actually going to be a 2-part process to be able to get this font in here. So the first thing that I need to do in my style is I need to tell it to use this font. So I have to tell it where to find it and what I want to call it. So I'm going to call this, it's going to be @FontFace. And this @FontFace is actually a CSS standard for pulling in additional fonts. The first thing that I need to do is I need to specify what I want this to be called. So I'm going to call this my Aftershock, and that's going to be the name. And now what I can do is anything that's in my document, if I reference font family my Aftershock, it will use this particular file. All right, so I have to tell it where to find the file. So the source is going to be in a URL, and the URL is going to be fonts/after_shock.ttf. So now what I'm doing is I'm specifying that I want to import a font face. I am going to call its font family my Aftershock, and here is where that file is actually located. Now, like I said, it is a 2-part process to apply the font. So the first one is telling it that we want to import this font, giving that font a name, and then actually telling it where to locate the font file. So what I need to do is I need to apply this to my div, and my div is not an ID, it's a class. So I want to tell it that within this class, any paragraph should be formatted this particular way. So I'm going to say a dot, and then it's Aftershock. And how should it be formatted? Well, it's not just the entire Aftershock class, it's just simply the paragraph. So if it's in a class called Aftershock and it happens to be a paragraph, how will it be formatted? So it will get formatted with a font family of My Aftershock. Now, one thing is Internet Explorer may or may not process the font correctly. So if you watch this font right here, right now it is formatted as Arial. When I refresh, it changes just a little bit. Now the problem is, even though this is a Truetype font, Internet Explorer is not always reliable on replacing the font properly. So that font should look something like this, but Internet Explorer did not display it properly, so we do need to be aware of that. So what I want to do is instead let's use this font. Okay, so what I can do is just simply change the name of the file. I don't have to change what I called it in my code. All I'm doing is just simply replacing the name of the file that's going to have the font that I want to play with. And so now if I come over and refresh, if you watch, now we get an actual script. So we get something that's much larger, much different font. And the only thing is it's a little bit smaller, it's harder to read, and we would want to make it larger to be able to read it better. The next thing that I want to play with are some translations and some transformations. I'm going to make another div, and this time it will have an ID. So its ID is going to be my text box. And it contains some text. All right, so I'm going to come up here in my style, and I want to format that, so it's called my text box. And how do I want to format it? First, I want to give it a border of 1 pixel solid black. I want to set its width to 100 pixels, and I want to set its height to 100 pixels. Save and refresh, and there is my box with some text in it. All right, I can do things like add colors to it. I could change where the text is located in there, but what I want to show to you is how to move this text box around, and also then how to do some minor transformations of it. The first one that I want to play with is called a transform. And what a transformation is actually sliding something around on the screen. So what I'm going to do with this my text box is transform it somehow. And to transform it, I am going to translate it. So I'm going to translate it 50 pixels to the right and 100 pixels down. When I save this and refresh, you'll notice that the box will move over 50 pixels and then move down about 100 pixels. And there it is. All right, now it is overlaying the other text. That's normal because I've just simply moved it down. I have not moved the other items. What this means is that as far as the browser is concerned, even though this box shows here on the screen, the space for it is still allocated up here. So nothing else will fill into here unless I manually put those things in there. Instead of translating, I can also spin it, and this is called rotate. So I'm going to rotate it a certain amount of degrees. And remember, our degrees, we have 360 degrees in a circle to play with. So I actually have from 0 to 359 degrees to play with. And so if I rotate this thing 20 degrees, it'll move back up here where it was before because I did away with the translate. And then it puts it on an angle. And notice it also puts the text on an angle. And I can still select it. It is still text. It's not a graphic, it's text. Before this, if I wanted to be able to rotate something on the screen, I would have to convert it to a graphic and then manipulate the graphic through something like Flash or some other type of animation software. I can also change the scale of this item. So if I want to put it back and then increase the size of it, I could do that by using the scale. And the scale is going to be in percentage. This is a multiplier of how big it originally was. So scale of 1, 1 would be 1 times its normal width, 1 times its normal height. So if I wanted to make it 120 times bigger than it should have been, I would do something like 1.20, and if I want to make its height 130%, it'd be 1.3. And when I save this, now I get a box that's a little bit bigger. So it's still, as far as these other items, this box still is only allocating just enough room for the original size. The browser will allow this to overlap other elements. Whenever you play with a transformation, you have to take into account that it's not necessarily going to take up the same amount of space. It may take up more space, and then we have to move other things around on the page accordingly. Instead of scaling it, I could also skew it, which skewing it means that we're going to take it one direction or another and make it look like I've actually elongated the top or the bottom. And so I'm going to skew this in either an X or Y format. So I'm going to start with X, and once again it's going to be an amount of degrees. So we're going to do 20 degrees, and when I save this, now I get a box that is skewed, and it now just becomes a parallelogram, but it's still text that's inside of it. Now if I change this from a skew X to a skew Y, then we'll get it like this. So now it looks like the box is tilting down. If I want to do both at the same time, I'm just going to use the skew, and then inside I'm going to do X comma Y inside the parentheses. So here if I want to do 30 degrees for my Y, 20 degrees for X, remember you're going to refresh, now you get it skewed in both manners. So what I can do with this is I can make things look like you're not looking straight at them. We can make things look a little bit three-dimensional. Other types of transforms that we have are rotations. And I can rotate not only in a two-dimensional space, but I could also rotate in a three-dimensional space. And so what I can do is I can do something like rotate X and rotate it 150 degrees. And when I do this, now what it does is it flips it over and makes it look like it's almost upside down. I could also rotate this Y and get it to flip vertically. Sorry, flip horizontally this direction. And now it's still backwards, but it's flipped the other direction. And if you notice, it looks like it's a little skinny because we've actually told it, don't flip it all the way around, just flip it somewhere around. So if I flip it, say 90 degrees, yep, now we're looking straight onto it. So we have to do something a little more. There we go. So 0 degrees would be straight. 90 degrees is looking straight on from the side of it, so that's why we didn't see anything. So if I go to 120, imagine taking the piece of paper and turning it around, and you'll start seeing that this looks like a three-dimensional object that we can rotate. The last rotation that we have is actually the Z-axis, which is our two-dimensional axis. So if I do rotate Z, then I can rotate it, and it's the same type of rotation that we had before, and it's still in terms of some amount of degrees. But we can actually rotate this now around 3 axes, and we can get things that look like three-dimensional movement with some animation. All right, so I'm going to put my little text box back the way it was before, and now what I want to play with are some transitions. So what I want to do is I want to make this box so that when we first see it, it's like this. But then when we hover over it, the box grows in size. So right now it's 100 pixels wide, and I want to make it where when I hover over it, it becomes 300 pixels wide. So what I am going to do is I'm going to make a pseudo class for this. So we'll call it my text box. And this is not just my text box, it's my text box hover. And what do I want to do? Well, when I hover, I want the width to be 300 pixels. Okay, so when I refresh, when I hover over top of it, it is now 300 pixels wide. And when I take my mouse off, it goes back to 100 pixels. Well, what I can do is I can actually specify that I want to see it expand. I want to give it a little bit of life and make it look like it's a little bit animated. To do this, I'm going to come up here in the original state, and I'm going to add a transition. And the transition is going to be if the width changes, how long should it take for that to change? So I'm going to set the width to 2 seconds. And so what happens now is when I refresh, if I hover, now I will see the box grow. And when I take my mouse off, now I see it shrink. So what it does is it will automatically make that animation for me to show the two states in between a hover and not being hovered. This time I want my box to not only grow in width, I also want it to grow in height. So what I'm going to do is in the hover state, I'm going to set its height to 400 pixels. And when I come over and refresh, watch what happens to the height and the width. So immediately goes to 400 pixels tall, but it transitions to the 300 pixels wide. So I'm going to make this a little bit smaller just so you can see it actually do it. But it immediately goes to the 200 pixels tall, but there's a transition for the width. So if I want to set the transition for the width and the height, then what I'm going to do is just simply add it right in here with the transition. I will say height and also make that 2 seconds. So now what I get is something that looks more like this. And I can also change the amount of time. So let's say I want the height to take 5 seconds as opposed to 2 seconds for the width. I can also do that. So the width moves over, and then now that that's over, the height is still going, and it'll take 5 seconds to get there. Same thing going back. The width comes right back over, but the height takes 5 seconds to come back. I'm going to set this back to 2 seconds just so it doesn't take quite so long. And what I want to do is I don't want it to do the transition as soon as I hover over it. I want it to wait because I may have accidentally put my mouse there and realized, or I might be moving my mouse over top of something. So sometimes I don't want the transition to occur right away. I might want to put a delay in it. So I'm going to say transition delay, and we'll set this to something like 2 seconds. So now when I refresh, I come over here, I hold my mouse, it doesn't do anything if I just put my mouse over top of it. But if I keep my mouse there for 2 seconds, then it will do the transition. When I move off, if I accidentally moved off and I didn't mean to do it, then it doesn't go back. But if I wait 2 seconds, then it will go back. And it's a way to keep you from having, let's say, 20 of these boxes where if you hover, they all expand. I have to actually sit and wait for 2 seconds before it to do this. So what that does is just gives me a way of preventing the user from getting annoyed by things moving around on the screen just by them moving their mouse. In this lesson, you learned about some of the new features in CSS3, how to embed web fonts on your web page, how to use text effects, transforms, and transitions to be able to rotate, skew, and translate your text, translate your divs, and then also how to make transitions so you can watch minor animations.